Welcome to part 2 of a 2-part series on reviewing vCops and how to work with vCops. In this section, we're going to talk about doing capacity management and capacity planning with vCops today. Just to do a quick introduction again, my name is Jim Silvera. I'm a solutions architect focused on vCops for our pre-sales group here at VMware. I've been in the industry for over 20 years and have been with VMware for the past 2.5 years focused on this tool set. But throughout my career, I've really focused on management tools in general. I hope you find today's information useful. Today's review is really focused around capacity, which is around our vSphere optimization assessment that was put together by Sue Moynihan. The information for this vSphere optimization assessment is focused on our partner group, and that information can be found in Partner Central if you want more information on the assessment itself. And if as a partner you have more questions, please contact your VMware sales manager. Additionally, this video can really be viewed by anybody who has interest in vCops and how to take advantage of some of the capabilities within it. So even though we're focusing on our partners here, it really is useful to the larger community as a whole. So as we jump into this today, just a quick review on part 1. Part 1, we did cover the dashboard, the badges, the relationship of the badges, and what the badges all meant to each other. We also did a quick review of the environment tab and how this is useful, as well as we did cover the operations tab as well, and we looked at a disk I/O workload issue on that and had reviewed what this tab is helpful for you for in troubleshooting and reviewing and understanding issues in the environment. What we're going to focus on in this section, though, is really focused around the planning tab. And the planning tab really focuses on the capacity-related information. So if we relate this back to the dashboard, this is all related to those risk and efficiency badges and the sub-badges under them. And if we're on the environment tab, it's all of the badges that are related here under risk and efficiency. And clicking on any risk or efficiency-related badge will take you to the planning tab itself. And depending on the badge, will focus on the area that the badge is focused on. So in just going to the planning tab, the first thing that you are presented with is a summary tab that gives you a review of the capacity in your environment, specifically in this case, looking at this cluster. So we can look at what's remaining, we can look at what's deployed, we can look at this from a virtual or physical standpoint, we can look at it from a sum or an average, and the summary is really helpful from giving you that overview. But it's not really where most people spend their time. What you really want is probably to get into some of the details. And the details really reside in the views right here. We'll get to the views in a moment. And whether you're on the summary or in the views, the other important aspect here is going to be the export button. Export button is available for any of this summary or the views that I'm going to talk about. And you're able to export the data that you're working with in either Adobe or CSV format. So make it shareable, make it a report, share it with a greater audience. So reporting is a built-in capability. And towards the end today, we'll cover the reports tab as well once we get through some of these details. So if we move over from this summary into the views, one of the first things that you'll notice is we'll just actually look at an example here of virtual machine capacity in the summary view. And we have scores here, and they break down based off of the individual resource, whether it be CPU, memory, disk, or network. How many more VMs are available, how long that's going to last, what the total capacity is, what's deployed, etc. And then you've got a summary at the bottom that says for capacity remaining, what is that restricted item? And we can actually see right here that CPU is our restriction based off of this section of the environment. But the big question that we often get asked is, especially with the product being pushed out just out of the box, is how can I trust those numbers? And how do I validate those numbers if I go and try and show those numbers to my boss? Or in this case, to my customer if I'm doing an assessment. So there is a couple of points that you really want to take away here of how do I trust these numbers and where do these numbers come from. Some of those are in relation to what type of settings do I want to set within the environment, as well as how do calculations get made. So first and foremost that we probably want to cover here very quickly is just scrolling through this list. You want to be aware of an item here called average virtual machine profile. And this average virtual machine profile is a calculation that's made for you that shows what is the average for the selected item in the environment, in this case this cluster, across each of these different settings. But then there's another key point here of what is the standard deviation in the environment. And standard deviation comes into play for the fact that maybe it hasn't been evaluating this environment for a very long period of time. So there is not a strict average, but some fluctuation there. Or this cluster has a high degree of change in it, and that change is introducing a standard deviation that a raw root average cannot be calculated. So what you'll see is in a steady state environment that's been monitored for quite a while where this standard deviation starts to equal the average, or there is no standard deviation being displayed. And that is the fact that a raw average can be calculated and that there is no fluctuation that I need to be concerned with. The important point is we take it into account. We make sure that this is accounted for in the calculations that we're providing for the capacity-related information. So the other important thing is whether you're here in this view that there is a profile in place that's also being applied here. And if we move back up to where we were of that virtual average machine capacity in the summary format, these scores here that I was mentioning just a moment ago really come from that average virtual machine profile. So something you should print out and share when you're doing either your assessment or validating these numbers with your boss. But the other thing that you want to make sure of is that you're aware that there is a profile in place right here. And this profile becomes really important. And the profile itself can be applied to the entire environment, but it can also be broken down that different elements in the environment get treated differently. For example, production elements versus test dev versus different types of workloads that I do have in my environment as well. We'll get into those details here in just a few seconds, but the first important point here is the fact that I can create groups. And these groups that I can create out of any criteria that I want. So I can make them dynamic or make them manual. Manual being I select the actual items that I want in the group, dynamic being criteria that I want to set. So I'm going to create a test group here very quickly. And if I do that, I can also choose whether or not the members get updated automatically based off the criteria. We're going to go ahead and click Next. And in doing so, I have all sorts of criteria that I can create these groups from, whether they be what are virtual machine criteria here that I want to include, and I can make them less than, equal to, greater than values, choose from all sorts of different values that are available. And based off of this, I can set and or statements in here to make it even more specific, or I can start searching for certain items in here that I want to add manually. So I can, with the dynamic, do a combination of manual and the dynamic criteria. So I would go ahead and save that group. I have a group created. In this case, I'm just going to cancel out to move on to the next concept. But the grouping is a very important concept to understand first and foremost. So what I then want to do once I have some groups created is really go into the configuration right here. And the way you need to think of the configuration is how do I want to overlay, how I want to manage my capacity, right? We have that average and standard deviation, and the policy is what is the nature of the environment for the way they want to manage the capacity from a conservative to a liberal standpoint. Everyone's a little bit different from an organizational standpoint, and everyone is also a little bit different from the standpoint that it depends on the resources that they want to manage as well. So this concept of having different policies, as I was saying, is not just at an organizational level, but it also depends on the resources themselves and the way they want to be managed. And every organization is different from the way they want to manage that capacity on that conservative versus liberal nature for how they want that to apply. And that's exactly what the policies are So let's actually dive into a policy. The first policy is a default policy. I can add as many policies as I want. I'm going to go ahead and edit the default policy for now. In editing the default policy, I can choose to clone this policy from others that I may have custom created. In this case, I haven't done that yet. But we also have a whole assortment of default policies out of the box. Things that are optimized for 15-minute peak periods and 30-minute peak periods, as well as excluding oversized analysis and ignore these objects and test dev and batch, etc. It's going to apply to all the settings that we're going to cover here in a few moments under each of these different sections. So just be aware that there are different policies. One of the ones that you may want to take advantage of for a POC specifically is an ignore these objects policy. Generally with POCs, or proof of concepts, we really want to focus on just a segment of the environment to prove out the point of how can vCOps be beneficial to you. In a production environment, we really want to actually, our production rollout, we really want to start to isolate and make sure we have different groups and are related to the different needs of the environment. So make sure that one of the concepts you have first and foremost is as you're doing your assessment or doing a POC, that you really probably want to focus on a cluster or a segment of the environment instead of the whole environment altogether. So once we do this here, we have an associations tab. And I just froze up. All right, so sorry about that quick freeze, but moving on, once we move on to the Associations tab, the Associations tab allows us to choose from those groups that I was talking about creating earlier. So now I can apply this policy to those groups. So now we move on to actually configuring the badges themselves. And if we're configuring the badges, what the badges are really doing is on the configuration of them, we're just choosing at what levels do they notify us. So at what levels do we get alerts generated? And sometimes these might need a little bit of fluctuation just for the amount of noise that might be created from the alerting standpoint. But the analytics are in play for how they control what scores they get to. But we're now choosing what scores do we want this notification to happen at, or whether or not we want a notification to happen at all or not. So we can actually turn that off. One of the best practices here is actually to raise our health scores to be very similar to our anomaly scores. So we probably want to raise this health up to a 90 level right here, as well as for the next level to be at that 75. And then we'll raise this up to be a 50. And this is just based off of some best practice suggestions. And actually, these best practices can not just be found on this video, but there's also within Partner Central a demystifying vCOps, how to do a POC demo presentation that you'll be able to find out there as well, that you'll be able to reference these settings that I'm talking about here. So these are really from the standpoint of how to probably best do an assessment or a POC, and they probably need to be thought out a little bit more detailed if you're rolling this out into a production environment. So the other thing that we find is that stress is actually probably set a little too stringently here. So we do find that we move this down to a 20, move these up a little bit to, for example, a 10 and a 5 score, which is probably going to choose where those points for getting the alerts are happening specifically on the stress-related scores. But other than those couple adjustments, everything else can probably be well left alone. And then we probably want to do this not just for infrastructure, but also for the VMs themselves. So this really relates to the hosts and the clusters. So we're going to go ahead and quickly adjust this for VMs. And we'll just adjust that stress score very quickly as well. All right, and then finally is I can affect how the group itself, the badge scores change, and there really is no recommendation on making an adjustment at this point on the groups, really just focusing primarily on the VMs and then as well as the infrastructure. So moving on to capacity and time remaining here, and this is where we start to get into even more detail about the environment itself. And there's some real important concepts that we really need to understand here. First and foremost is this understanding of demand and allocation here at the bottom. And actually, it's probably recommended that you might leave both on, and they both have their places. So with an allocation model, you're really going to see where that reduces your risk of capacity shortfalls by over-provisioning. So it also maps to possibly your client's production policies. So where I have needs that are saying I have to have this allocation of resources and I have a demand, I have a need that I'm going to assign so much CPU and so much memory and you're not allowed to adjust it. That's where the allocation model really comes into play. But the cons of this is it does not really does not maximize how I'm managing costs from an early provisioning of the resources, and it also may not handle all your burst and peak workloads, as well as it does not account for overcommit ratios. And then the demand is really, as it says, what's the demand on the resource in the environment? And this is where we can really focus on increasing density and minimizing waste and cost and making sure that we're accounting for CPU and memory overcommits and also accounting for peaks and wastes in the environment from a forecasting standpoint. This does not account for any vendor or company policies that might be around best practices, which is where the allocation model comes into play. And it's less adopted in production since it's also possibly more aggressive, right? So this is really where we're really focusing on what is that oversized and undersized is by doing demand. So if we do a little bit of both, we get some pros by using both. So by using the allocation model, we can create a safe top-line allocation and manage capacity. And by using the demand model in conjunction, we can also catch unexpected bursts and peaks and prevent waste in the environment. It also helps you compare the demand on a cluster versus allocation to assess performance and also provide true ROI to your upper management as well. So there is a recommendation here that you actually use both of them. So one of the other things that you want to do is make sure that, as is selected here, that you're using stress to account for your spikes and peaks. And why is this? Stress is an option that will help you plan for hourly spikes, and most workloads, even batch, exhibit spikes in your environment. And also, you can set this item here called usable capacity, which is really important for you to set as well. And this is going to take into account any buffers that you want to set in the environment, and we'll talk about those buffers here in a moment. So these two are also suggested as a best practice. The time remaining here is recommended to use a planning cycle versus just using real time. But with the planning cycle, what I can do is I can add a days of provisioning for my environment for the time remaining. For how long does it take me to acquire and provision new resources? So there's obviously a purchasing time and a provisioning time for acquiring and pushing out new hosts and resources in the environment for capacity, and this is making sure that I have that buffer in place so it doesn't tell me that I'm running out and I still need to go through that process of acquiring it. So let's move on to the usable capacity here, which you'll remember we set this usable capacity radio button here on this tab, and this is where we define it. So in defining the usable capacity, there are probably some recommendations here, and the recommendations are probably for doing the assessment in a POC, and you want to turn on buffers, and these buffers are just limiting how much do I leave as overhead. If this was a production environment, I probably want to set these buffers a lot higher. I don't want to use 100% of what's available in my environment or suggest that, but really this is what it is, suggesting that 100% of the environment is deployable and available from a capacity standpoint. So I want to leave some buffers there to make sure I'm accounting for the environment accurately. And for the assessment of POC, we recommend that you just make these 20%, for example. If it was a production environment, as I suggested, you may want to be more conservative and raise these numbers up higher than this. And this is really just a discussion to happen with your customer to figure out what is the preferred buffers for the environment. And we're also going to leave it alone as the last known capacity as well. All right, so moving on to the usage calculation. The usage calculation becomes really important from the standpoint of what represents the business day and how do we look at that calculation. For the purposes here, we're going to leave it alone at 24/7, but for your assessment, you should discuss with the customer what is the planned usage for those resources. Are these overnight, are these 24 hours a day, or are these during the day? And it really is going to depend on the environment itself. And then the other thing that you really want to consider here is what are your allocation over commit ratios. So for a test dev, you probably want this possibly at a 4-to-1 ratio. In a production environment, you may want to consider a 2-to-1, but 2-to-1 or 4-to-1 is usually the recommendations. From a memory standpoint for production, we really don't want to set these to any value other than 0 for the disk space and for the memory. But for example, if this is a test dev environment, we may want to set memory to 100%, and we may want to set disk space to 50%. So it really depends on the environment that we're looking at here. So moving on to the powered off and idle VMs. What we're looking at here is what's representing a powered off VM in the environment. And in this case, for example, for doing a POC or this assessment, we can set this to 100%. One of the other things that we may want to do is actually turn off any disk I/O calculation and leave on the CPU usage and the network I/O calculation here. And the default settings are fine for these other than turning off disk I/O. So this should be pretty straightforward for the fact of what is representing the powered off and the percent of time, and then as well as what is representing that usage. So we want to make sure we're not accounting for just an update of antivirus that is representing something that is not being used from an idle standpoint. So moving on to oversized and undersized here. And with the oversized and undersized, we really do want to make a couple of changes here, and actually probably not too many. The 30% and the 1% is fine, and actually using the 70% here, we probably want to leave that alone. But right here for the more than this percentage, we probably want to move this up to 10%. And also, we don't want to take into account the entire range. We probably want to make it for any period, and for default, we're going to go ahead and leave this alone. So for interactive or server workloads, we generally recommend this to be an hour. And then if they're batch workloads, we should also, and if you create a group for it, we should consider this to be what is the length of time that that batch workload generally runs for. All right, so again, this information can be found in the Demystifying vCops How to Do a POC PowerPoint presentation that I mentioned earlier. But one of the other important points here in setting this oversized and undersized VM scenario is actually probably a picture that I could draw for you real quick. And I'm going to pull up actually a tool here real quick, and I'm going to make this pretty raw. We're going to use Notepad right here. Actually, no, we're not going to use Notepad because Notepad I can't draw in. So here we go. Soft paint. All right. I'm just going to quickly draw a box here. And for the sake of argument at this point, we're going to say that this box represents, the top line represents 100%. And we're going to suggest that the bottom line right here represents 0%. And depending on the scenario, just be aware that these percentages could reverse. The top line could represent the 0. The bottom line represents the 100. What I'm also going to do right here is I'm going to actually draw a dashed line in here. I know that's not all that straight. Forgive me. But this dashed line, we're going to suggest that this represents some value that's a variable. And in this case, we're going to say that this represents 70%, for example. Hopefully my computer will catch up here. Looks like it didn't want to catch up on the typing. 70%. There we go. All right. So this 100 and 0% are kind of limits, and the 70% is actually a value that we set in the preceding page. So I'm going to actually refer back to that page real quick. So this 70% here is representative of that dashed line. I'm going to explain this 10% here in just a second. So what we have is CPU and memory workloads that are happening. And they're kind of sine waves that happen. They come through and they go above the line, and maybe they spike really high above the line and come right back down. Maybe they spike just a little bit above the line, they come back down. Maybe they go above the line and stay there for a little while, and they come back down, and et cetera, and they go on. What we're really interested in are these clip points right here. So these clip points are what's important to us. And this is really what we're saying. So I'm going to go ahead and actually take a marker, and I'm going to shade in this section right here, because that section of the clip point, this section of the clip point, this section of this clip point, these are the areas that are most concerned to me. And what we're saying with this is, what is the period of time that these clip points are staying above this line between these two vertical lines? So I'm using a surface area calculation where a quick spike peak like this has just as much impact as a small little blip, as just as much impact as a medium duration long item. So I'm saying, what is the total surface area that's being taken up? So if we go back to our settings here, we're saying, what is that total surface area for percentage-wise that it's staying at this 70% clip point? And then for how long is that period of time, representing the calculation for what's that surface area calculation between the two vertical lines. This is a very accurate way to determine what is oversized and undersized, because the very fast, quick spikes have just as much impact as the small ones and just as much impact as the long duration medium ones. So now I'm just truly taking up a surface area calculation to determine whether or not it's oversized or undersized. So we can do this for VMs. We also have this calculation for the infrastructure as well. And if we go to the infrastructure, we're going to do the same thing that we did on the previous slide. We're going to go ahead and increase this to 10%, and we're going to make it for that 1 hour period. And as well, you want to refer to that document that I mentioned earlier for any other suggested changes that may be here as well. So configuring alerts. For a POC, what's really recommended is that you actually turn off a handful of these alerts. So for time remaining, capacity remaining, we're going to go ahead and turn those off. Explain this in just a moment. We're also, actually, those are the only ones that we're going to turn off. So here's the big point. You're doing a POC, you're doing this assessment. You don't want to inundate that environment with a lot of alerts of things that may not, one, be anything that is necessary to the environment, and also show that there's a lot of noise going on. So We can do alerts, but generally what you want to do is put a plan in place from a production standpoint for when and what you want to be notified on. And we don't need to do any unnecessary alerting when there's just an evaluation going on. So we're just going to calm down the amount of noise that the alerts are going to generate. And then finally, on the configure the forecast and the trends here, what we want to do is possibly update these to take into account a larger data set. So for example, eliminate nonlinear functions for data sets less than, and we're going to say 40 points. And here's the point of increasing these point values or increasing these settings. What we're really doing is by taking 40 data points instead of the 4 data points, we're smoothing out that line and taking more samples along the way to give better calculations with. And then as well, we also want to apply one or more smoothing filters prior to trending. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to turn on this detect outliers and plateaus in using this. And we're going to use this default here of 5% and 25% as well. All right, so at this point, we also want to save this. And I'm going to go ahead and select done here. All right, so now that we've saved that, the other item that we're going to want to do is actually go into this manage display settings right here. And in managing the display settings, we're going to go ahead and click the edit button right here. And we are going to make some changes in here. So one of the changes that we may want to make is, actually, it doesn't suggest any changes, but you want to take into account what is the view that you're looking for. So right now, when you look at the data here, you're looking at an interval as being daily versus weekly or monthly. You're also looking at a default, what your default time window is of what is the quantity of intervals, and also when we're trending views is also what is the interval period here as well. So you want to make sure that these intervals are taken into account when you're showing the data that's going to be displayed here. So daily does not average hours like weekly settings do, and especially on stress and weight. So more data for what your time remaining is, and visually it's going to look better when you take these into account. All right, so at this point, we've set up our configuration, and by setting up our configuration, you're going to see that our numbers actually changed. Instead of 13 VMs that I have available, I'm actually over by 16 at this point. So it actually probably made the scenario look a little bit worse, and I have 0 days left. But you're going to see that that configuration has a direct impact on what are these calculations and probably make them more realistic. So you're going to need to make sure that you take that into account in your customer's environment. The other important thing that you're going to want to do in here is focus on some of the other views that are in here. So I was just showing you this example of that virtual machine capacity as an overview. But you're also going to want to be aware of the oversized virtual machines that are in here and this report here. And for this cluster, we'll let this build for a moment. And it's going to show us, based off of each virtual machine, what policy is in use, what is currently configured, what the recommendation is. By doing that recommendation, what is going to be the percentage of use, and then also what are the recommendations for configuring the configured memory and also where the recommended memory is. You'll also want to look at the undersized virtual machines as well. And just like in looking at any other of these views in here, remember that there's an export button, and that export button allows you to export this in a shareable format of PDF or CSV. So again, it's going to show the recommendations on what is the suggested changes for the environment for the undersized as well. And then you also get your list of what's your powered off VMs, what are your idle virtual machines, which is actually over there above the oversized. So these are the views that you're going to want to actively work with in managing the environment for the assessment that you're going to be doing. Final point that I want to make here in talking about that export button is these views really are where you're going to want to do your work from, where most administrators will spend their time, and most of them will probably export these results as they work with them. But there is a reports tab over here, and the reports tab is very identical to what we were just dealing with on the planning tab in the views. So we have those reports of idle, oversized, the overview of the environment, etc. There is a Run Now button that allows us to run the reports now. This Run Now is very equivalent to clicking the Export button on the Planning tab. So if you're just trying to get the report exported and actually use it, I would suggest that you probably run it from the Planning tab versus coming here and doing the Run Now. But the real benefit of using the Reporting tab allows us to click on the New Schedule button. And with the New Schedule button, I can set up a schedule, and if I set up my SMTP settings, I can actually send that as an email and be auto-delivered on a schedule of my basis. So I can actually share these and do so on an automated basis based off of this scheduling capability. But if you're actively working with the tool, as I mentioned, the reports are really repetitive of what's available here on the Planning tab. And remember, with the Planning tab, as well as with the reports, they are focused based off the element of the environment that I have selected. So for this cluster, if I was to change the focus, the reports that would be listed there or the planning that I would be doing would be changed to the focus element that I was on. So one final concept here for today, we're going to go ahead and move over here to this virtual machine capacity again that we were on, is the fact that I can create new what-if scenarios. And what-if scenarios are really helpful for the fact of planning for projects that are happening at your customer location. So for example, we can do a what-if scenario on virtual machines here. And if I click next, I can choose to add a virtual machine based off a profile, kind of a net new, how many and what's that going to look like. But what's probably more popular is to use this middle selection here, because generally, I'm just going to add more of what I got. I need more SQL servers. Well, I got SQL servers, and they look like this, or they look like this, or they look like this, or I need a combination of that to represent an application. I click Next, and then I can choose how many of each. So I want 5 of these, and I want 3 of those, and I want 2 of these. I click Next. It confirms it. I click Finish. What you would have noticed is there was a third selection there of deleting virtual machines. Very similar to the Add window, except I'm going to use checkboxes to check which ones do I want to suggestively remove and how is that going to impact capacity. So here you can see what the actual is, what happens if I add 10 more VMs. And if I use that export feature, I can include the what-if scenario. One last what-if scenario here, so we're going to create one more scenario. And in creating one more scenario, we have the ability to do hosts and data stores as well. I'm just going to go ahead and add one host here. We can modify what that host is going to look like. We're going to keep them pretty small at this point. We're going to go ahead and click Next. Don't want to do anything with data stores, add, remove, etc., just like with hosts. I'm not going to do anything there. I'm just going to go ahead and finish this. And in finishing this, what you're going to see is, again, what the actual is. What if I add to 10 VMs? What if I change to one host? Well, just be aware that there's a drop down here where instead of doing compare that it does by default, we can do a combine. And in doing the combine, we'll then say, what if I do add the VMs and add the host? And that's probably what most people want to look at. And I can add as many different scenarios as I want here. I can go back and edit them, and then I can also remove them as well. So pretty powerful stuff with being able to do the what-if scenarios here within vCops. So with that, I'm going to close it out for today. I hope that this information was helpful. I hope this gave you a better understanding and overview of vCops, especially in how do these settings get applied and how do these numbers get calculated. Again, don't forget about that first video and the review of the dashboard, and that one final concept that I had that I talked about when I went over that scenario was how do I make vCops make a more proactive environment for me? And that was that concept of starting out here in the efficiency column, working with my reclaimable waste, which is going to improve my density, which is going to further improve my capacity and time remaining, which is going to affect my risk, and then dealing with my stress, which is really my undersize of my environment, which is going to improve my workloads, improve my health, and reduce the likelihood for anomalies and faults. So this piece today of working with planning really goes a long way in building a better proactive, better managed environment for you to be able to help your customers with. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off, and I appreciate your time today. Thank you.